Good morning. Here we are at the Regional Conference for Region 3 in Philadelphia, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Milton Garland. My name is Charlie Hank with the Historical Committee, and today we'll start off with Milton giving us a few pointers on your background, how you got started in the refrigeration industry.
Well, when I graduated in 1920 from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, jobs were hard to come by. In fact, many of my classmates come down into Pennsylvania for jobs. My home was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I wished to get employment near home. Just come into Waynesboro with the idea of getting a job, and was successful in getting employment with the Frick Company. That was in July of 1920.
Okay. Before that, what was some of your background? Did you live in Massachusetts?
No.
In your early life?
My hometown was Harrisburg,
Harrisburg,
Pennsylvania.
okay.
I liked athletics, my major item being running. I actually was offered a scholarship at Pennsylvania State College, which I turned down because I wanted engineering of the first class. As of that particular time, the engineering colleges were listed by the Navy, and among the 5 colleges which they claimed to be the best, Worcester Tech was one of them.
I see. So that's why you went there. And then after college, you said you were in the service for a while?
Well, it was during college.
During college.
In World War I, it's just the same as World War II. Engineers, people that type, were eliminated from the draft. But in my junior year, just towards the end, they said, well, sorry, we need people, and we were put back into the draft. And so I immediately enlisted in the Navy.
You said that in 1920, then you started, when you graduated, you started working for the Frick Company, moving back to your home area. What was it like starting for the Frick Company in 1920?
The Frick Company at that time had a policy that any person wanting to be an engineer or a salesperson had to spend at least 1 year in field installation work. And my first year was simply out in the field working with people installing equipment.
I see. And then after that, what did you progress to after your first year?
Unfortunately or fortunately, I knew construction work very well, having had prior experience, and I was retained in the field up to the point where I said, well, I don't want in the field, and if I can't get into engineering, I may have to look elsewhere. The result was that as of 1923, just 3 years after joining the company, I was placed in full charge of all field installation work.
But that didn't get you into the engineering, did it? It still kept you in the field?
Well, yes, as of that time, manufacturers did not have much of anything in the way of a laboratory. The field was really the laboratory. Of course, all jobs were guaranteed as to performance. So, at the end of the installation, we would usually have a nominal 1-week performance demonstration. And that performance demonstration, we took complete data of everything, pressures and temperatures. And in a sense, that was the laboratory for companies.
So you actually went out and you were really commissioning the systems right there, making sure they were operating properly, which we don't see a lot of today. A lot of times you get a factory piece of equipment that goes in, gets installed, and never tested.
That is right, except for the testing work that the manufacturer might have done. Now, as of today, we do have a laboratory, and we do test individual items, but there's no testing of that in connection with the other things it's going to be connected to in the field.
To get an overall system effect of how the system works.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, okay. Now then, you're with the Frick Company. What happened during the Depression with the Frick Company? Did they still stay fairly busy?
Well, as of the middle and late 20s, that was a boom period. We were putting in ice-making plants all over this country. I had as many as 40 jobs going on at one time. The Florida boom started at that time. When the Depression hit, I was in New York City, and we didn't carry much cash in those days. The company kind of said, you who are traveling, you always are privileged to go into our sales office and they will cash checks for you. We had several jobs going on in New York City. We were hearing rumors about this terrible depression which was coming on. I go back to the office because I'm short of cash to get back to Waynesboro. The office is closed. The banks had closed. When the people in the offices heard about that, they immediately went out, got cash wherever they could get a check cashed, and there I was stalled in New York City without enough money to get back to Waynesboro.
So how'd you manage to get back?
I went to the Pennsylvania Railroad station. I told the man behind the ticket counter, I said, here's my gold watch and chain. I said, I would like to leave it with you if you could accommodate me with a ticket, and when things get straightened out, I'll come back and pick it up. And the man was good enough to do so.
Oh, that's fantastic. So then after the Depression, what was happening with you with the Frick Company?
Well, could I tell you one other thing
Sure.
about the Depression? These men who were installing these jobs in Florida, and Florida had this terrific boom, they had invested money in land. Now, they had received that money by overdrawing their account with Frick Company in Waynesboro. And now they're in the same situation. They cannot carry on the necessary payments, and so what can we do? For the most part, Frick Company did not demand immediate repayment of the overdraws. People who had sold the land said, well, we will wait, please hold it. And some of those fellows later on, at the time of their retirement, really made a lot of money out of that particular investment.
Interesting. So then what happened after that with you with the Frick Company?
Well, as the recovery built, it built rather slowly, but You see, it was right at that time that the halocarbon refrigerants come along. And so now, with the halocarbon refrigerants, there's just opened up the field for air conditioning. And Frick Company, as well as York, we immediately just reconfigured our compressors so that our current line of ammonia compressors could handle the halocarbon refrigerants. And so really, it was the demand for machinery for air conditioning work that helped rebuild the country and the refrigeration field. Frick Company was active in air conditioning work. We air conditioned the War Department, the early offices there on Virginia Avenue in Washington, and many of the larger hotels. Now, in those hotels, that air conditioning really just extended as far as the dining rooms and not into the whole building.
Not out through the rooms that people were staying in.
That's right.
I see. I see.
Now, as the economy improved, then the building of ice plants and food freezing's now coming in a big way. And so in the late 30s and before World War II, business had picked up. It had really reached a point where Frick Company had to make a decision. Are we going to go big way with air conditioning or stay with industrial work and just only do the air conditioning in specialized installations? And that was the decision that was made at that time. York Company decided that they were going to put the major emphasis on air conditioning. And later on, they completely dropped out of the industrial field.
I see. What happened during the Second World War?
On the Second World War, we were 100% on defense work. It just so happened that our foundry, which was capable of making very large castings, the old A-frame machines demanded those big castings. So we did a lot of work for others in making big castings. One or two of the important items were lathe beds, 85 feet long, to accommodate gun making. And then our compressors, particularly the intermediate size and around 30, 40 horsepower, they were going big into the Navy. All the big battleships in Missouri and the New Jersey and the Iowa, they had 34 units air conditioning the ammunition holes. In 1940, just prior to the war, I got a pretty good idea that the war was coming on for real because we were asked to make an installation for a gun firing room at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Now, it was a very modest installation, in that we were to cool a tank down to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. All parts were supposed to be at minus 10 within an 8-hour period. That was accomplished. A gun firing room had a slot in the roof with doors, and they could open those doors and were supposed to be able to raise the barrel of the gun to an elevation that they could shoot out from where it was sitting. Ammunition was in the room at the same time and cooled down to the same temperature. I remember well that it was the Sherman tank, the big modern tank of the day, and quite a few dignitaries from Washington were there at the time of the initial test run. The first stage was passed. They were satisfied that everything was down to temperature, and now the order was given to start the engine in the tank. The engine would not start. Cartloads of batteries were pulled in, but no amount of battery power would start that engine. That then was abandoned, and they said, well, we'll just go through with the gun firing. Let's open a breech, load the gun. They could not open the breech of that gun. Okay, let's elevate the gun. They could not elevate the gun.
Everything is frozen up.
Finally, in desperation, they said, well, let's get this tank out of here and bring another one in. When they hooked up a tank from the outside, the tracks would not turn. In other words, at that particular moment, lubricants were not anywhere near the state of the art as they are today. And this was all a fault of the lubricants. Later on, we built engine testing. Engine testing now was to be down at minus 75 degrees. Common gasoline at that particular time would freeze at minus 40 degrees. The tremendous improvement, I would say, occurred because we had refrigeration available, which would enable us to get down to the temperatures that they knew they were going to encounter in the field. I'll never forget one engine testing plant for a Lycoming engine. They were aircraft engines. Now, in addition to cooling a room, we had to also cool the air that was coming in to operate the engine. My concern as an engineer in connection with the job was frosting of the coils. But frosting of the coils did not present any great problem. We were able to take care of that. But the first engine ran just a matter of about 5 minutes and then stopped because it was plugged with snow. What we discovered was that when we got into air temperatures below minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, frost no longer clung to the pipe surfaces, the evaporator surfaces, but just went out into the atmosphere in snow, which simply resulted in having to rig up snow traps so that that didn't interfere with the engine operation.
It was an interesting problem you solved. Now, after the war, what was going on with the freight company through the early 50s into the 60s?
Well, it was a difficult time. It was difficult in this respect. During the war, we had priorities, and we could get the oil that we were selling for our machines, but then the Korean situation come up. Now, the priorities that we had in World War II were no good at this time. And suddenly the people who were supplying us with lubricants, as well as some of our high-grade steels, said, sorry, we cannot accept your orders. The reason being that the Army and the Navy, at the time of the Korean situation, they just slapped priorities. And only people who had the required priority could get these high-grade materials.
Okay. Now, you've been involved in ASHRAE, I guess, since, what, 1920? Or ASRE?
No.
When did you join ASRE?
I joined ASRE in 1925.
Okay.
And when that depression hit in the late 20s, early 30s, at the time I couldn't get home from New York, my brother had started an ice-making plant. I was involved financially, and immediately in that depression, the bank foreclosed our mortgage. Mm-hmm. The question was, why pick on us? Our neighbors here, we know that they're broke and haven't been paying interest in the principal, but we have been. They said, yes, that's why we're after you. We have to have cash.
I see. They knew you had cash, so you were paying it, so they wanted it.
That's right.
Right. So going back to ASRE, in 1959, ASRE merged with ASHVE.
Yes. I had dropped my ASRE membership for a number of years there because everything I had to put in to salvage that ice plant. And then I rejoined immediately, or sometime during World War II there. Mm-hmm. And prior to the time of the jointure mm-hmm. of the two societies.
How do you think the joining of the two societies benefited ASRE?
Well, it benefited ASRE because ASRE was a relatively small group as compared to SHVE. And so now we were going to have a much bigger group and presumably going to have the benefits of the joint information. Refrigeration, of course, was a vital item in air conditioning. And, of course, air conditioning was a vital item as regards the sales of refrigeration. So it looked to be beneficial. There were some other things that really disrupt the jointure. There was a move on foot to outlaw the use of ammonia. And many of the industrial people who were heavily involved in ASRE, they were greatly upset over this attempt to outlaw ammonia. They felt like as though the jointure, since the larger number of people were from the air conditioning field would hurt them in their fight to salvage ammonia. That was the time of the organization of IIAR. It was simply a self-defense matter.
I see. So a lot of the ASRE people joined IIAR.
That's right.
They left the new ASHRAE organization.
That's right. That's right.
Now, you've been involved in ASHRAE for a number of years on technical committees. What are some of your committees you've served on?
Well, one of the first committees was on lubrication. And I think that was because of the fact that along in the late 20s, none of the manufacturers sold oils, that is, the machinery manufacturers. They simply recommended a so-called ice machine oil. An ice machine oil was nothing more than a straight-run mineral oil. You cannot have any of the additives that are used in automotive type oil in a refrigeration system, because refrigerants will throw them out. The Pennsylvania fields, which were the paraffin-based oil, they were running out. Louisiana, Texas, and California, those fields were opening up, but the base of that oil was naphthenic. And now the people who were supplying the oils said, now we're going to have an improved oil. It'll be, we'll just call it Arctic Sea Heavy. We all went along with it, just thinking that the oil people knew what they were doing. But unfortunately, at that time, the refining that was available did not remove the resins from the oil. And now those resins with that oil, and right at the hot area of the piston ring, when a machine was shut down, those resins would simply change to a varnish. And now we had a machine with the pistons varnished to the cylinders, and it could not be turned over.
So every time a company would turn off their machine, it would just seize up.
That's right. It would freeze up.
Freeze up.
And the warranty expense was so great that York and Frick immediately went into supplying their own oils. Now, naturally, we had to buy them from refinery people, but we were now buying on a specific specification, which really what it amounted to is we were going back to the original Pennsylvania class of oil, the paraffin-based oil.
You're also on TC 8.1.
Yes, that related to compressors. I, over the years, been on and off of that at every opportunity possible. I always had a normal 4-year tenure and then 1 year off. That was excellent work. We had many, many seminars. Most of those seminars were really related to telling people what was necessary in the design and operation of a system to give maximum protection to that compressor.
I see. Okay. Now, in 1967, I believe it was, you were elevated to the, I'm not sure, in 1967 you were a life member of ASHRAE. You're also a fellow of ASHRAE. What year did you become a fellow? Do you remember?
I became fellow before I became a life member.
So that was probably sometime in the late 50s, early 60s.
I do not recall the exact date.
Okay. It's a very big honor to be a fellow of the Society. You've also received the Distinguished Service Award.
Yes.
In addition, you have now a new Refrigeration Award named after you, the Milton Garland Refrigeration Award.
That's right.
It has to be a great honor to...
It certainly has been.
And I understand that also in the Region 3, you have made a donation to Region 3 to start a Milton Garland Scholarship Fund.
Yeah, the purpose there was simply this. When I was in college, while I had good training relative to thermodynamics, there was nothing that you might say that encouraged me or even intimated that the field of refrigeration, whether it's industrial or air conditioning, was a good way to go. And I found out that in the high schools and most colleges, there was very little emphasis placed on that, the area of refrigeration as a good place for employment. People were just given the basic fundamentals of thermodynamics, and that was the extent of the training.
Now, ASHRAE has taken a big step recently to get back and strengthen the R position. We now have R handbooks. How do you feel about that move?
Well, I think it's a wonderful move, and it's one that I worked hard to try to get going. We still need to do more to get the industrial people back into ASHRAE.
Okay. Okay, Milt, tell us how refrigeration has changed since you've been involved in the industry from 1920 to today.
Well, the industry has grown terrifically. Now, when it comes to change, the compression refrigeration cycle has not changed at all. We've had tremendous changes in ideas as to how to correctly handle those refrigerants. When I first started in 1920, naturally being new to the business, I read magazines and went to various meetings, and here was a red-hot discussion about wet or dry compression.
Okay.
Now, what's
the difference? Yeah.
Wet compression? Well, there was a company by the name of De La Verne, had a plant in Jersey City, and they were the chief competition for both Frick and York and Filter. They said, now, we inject oil at each stroke of the piston for the purpose of filling the clearance area. By filling that clearance area, there was no re-expansion, and therefore we got a much bigger volume of new gas back into the cylinder. And their argument was correct. On the other hand, people building the dry compressors said, well, okay, if you could do that successfully, but you don't do it successfully because people over-adjust the oil and that results in severe damage, even breakage of the cylinder, blowing out of the head. So we recommend the dry compression because there's no danger of that damage. Now, in the end, the dry compression worked out because it was the safest way to go.
What are you seeing today with the screw compressors that we see in most air conditioning equipment?
Well, the screw compressor, you see, again, is a wet compressor. In other words, the screw compressor would not be what it is until we went to the large volume of oil. I personally ran tests on the List-Home screw compressor, the dry compressor. Those tests were back in 1946. The efficiency was so poor that the company wouldn't have anything to do with it. But later on, some European people come up with the idea that, well, we'll just put an excess amount of lubricating oil in there and fill up those leakage areas, and we accomplished two things. When running dry, we ran at very high speeds, far above 3,600, the maximum with two-pole motor. But now, with the oil injection, we can run at 3,600 and have a highly efficient compressor because we fill up the clearance area and we fill up the leakage areas. We wind up with a lower temperature in the discharge vapors. Of course, we did add the problem of oil separation, but that has been successfully corrected to the point where today screw compressors are sold guaranteed with an oil usage not to exceed 50 parts per million.
Now, you've been involved with ammonia throughout your career. Tell us something about the ammonia industry.
Well, ammonia was, of course, the original refrigerant from industrial viewpoint. It always will be the best refrigerant for several reasons. One of the main reasons is that it takes less than a half a pound per minute per ton of refrigeration. Whereas all of your halocarbon refrigerants, they take more than 2 pounds per minute per ton of refrigeration. Now, naturally, it's going to take less energy to move a half a pound of refrigerant around the system than what it's going to take to move 2 pounds per minute per ton around that system.
We hear a lot about the toxicity of ammonia. How do you feel about that?
I think ammonia is the safest refrigerant in this respect. It gives a warning. Nobody is going to stay around with an ammonia concentration which is going to be harmful. Your only fear with ammonia is panic. Naturally, people are going to try to get away from it. And this is why I wouldn't want to have ammonia positioned where any escape could affect a lot of people. But for industrial work, and when we keep it confined away from where it could get where there was a crowd of people, to me, it's the safest refrigerant.
I see. What are some of the applications you've seen used for ammonia in your career?
Well, ammonia has been applied for the cooling of anything that you can imagine.
You'd mentioned about a problem before of solubility of ammonia. Can you relate that story to me again on the ice?
Well, ammonia can be the refrigerant for air conditioning if we keep the ammonia and ice making remote from the air conditioning area. Making ice with ammonia, then transporting that ice, of course the ice has to be in a fragmentary form, over into the area of air conditioning is perfectly safe because ice will not carry ammonia. We might say, well, now, suppose you got a leak here, and this got into this ice prior to its moving. We still will not carry any ammonia with that ice. Now, I know that from experience with the old block ice-making plants, where ice in the storage was exposed to an ammonia leak. And a lot of the surface of the ice had been melted because of that leak. Naturally, there was always the claim of who's going to pay for the lost ice. We would accept just the loss in weight. And that was a successful conclusion because ice taken to laboratories and tested, they never could find any ammonia in that ice.
How do you feel about the CFC issue today?
Well, again, the CFCs must be eliminated on the basis of what others tell us that makes it harmful.
Okay.
Our substitutes, of course, is the big problem. One thing that has not been mentioned in particular is the extreme difference in density. Ammonia has a density about half that of air. A refrigerant like 22 has a density 1.6 times greater than the density of air. So we have, from a viewpoint of safety, the two distinct situations. Ammonia will rise.
Being lighter than air, yes.
Being lighter than air. Mm-hmm. Your halocarbon refrigerants, as well as CO2, will fall. It simply means that if we apply venting with a halocarbon refrigerant, our vent outlet should be near the floor level.
Right.
With ammonia, the vent outlet should be near the ceiling. Mm-hmm. But this is something that's often overlooked because there never has been, this is something that's often overlooked because there never has been any particular emphasis on the fact that these density differences do exist.
I see. Okay. You've been involved in the society, and you've seen many very various presidents throughout your years. How has the society changed over the years? From your influence with being involved with presidents and on technical committees, and just in general, how you've seen things go with society?
Well, I have no quarrel in any way with the conduct of the society. I am apprehensive of certain things of this sort. The work is voluntary. A man serves on a committee for 4 years, and then he's removed to give place for others. Now, that is an excellent idea, but the fault often exists in the fact that that new man lacks in experience. He's anxious to serve, but he doesn't have experience to bring along to really give something to that technical committee. And I have witnessed the fact that a committee like 8.1, which for many years was providing seminar or something similar almost yearly to the society, but hasn't given much of anything in the last 6 or 7 years. And it's not because the people there don't want to give it. It's simply the lack of experience that enables them to put it together.
I see. Do you think that the committee can go out and sort of recruit people that have the experience to join the committee?
Yes. The society asks for people to volunteer for the work. And many of those people are capable individuals. They're anxious to join, but again, they haven't passed any kind of a test as to their qualifications to work in that committee.
What do you think people that are qualified to work on that committee, why aren't they coming forward to work on the committee?
Well, I hate to say it, but it's because they don't belong.
They don't feel like they belong.
That's it. Mm-hmm. There was a day when out of, I'll say, 12 engineers at Frick Company, all 12 were members of ASHRAE. Mm-hmm. Today, with no less than 30 engineers, less than half a dozen belongs to ASHRAE.
I see. It's a shame that they all aren't members of ASHRAE.
That's right.
Get involved.
Now, to me, what I see as the reason is the one that they give. What is there for me in ASHRAE? The ASHRAE Journal, as received by myself and others in Frick Company, is made available for them to read, which they do. And what they read, 99.9% relates to air conditioning. Now, we have a tremendous change in this whole refrigeration application field. People who put together package units, train, carrier, York. That unit is factory designed, factory tested, and is top-notch in every respect. But it works in just a very narrow temperature range. But people who are working in refrigeration in the industrial field, they're looking at something entirely different. In the industrial field, the manufacturers no longer sell a complete installation. For the most part, manufacturers are now component builders, and others in the field buy such components and put them together into a system. So now, the whole question is, those others who are saying, now we ought to have this compressor, we ought to have this kind of evaporator, we ought to have this kind of a recirculation system, do they carry the necessary experience to really be qualified to do that work? So the industrial field, from my observation, they're the field that is demanding training. They're demanding training because they have these plants, they're complex, they are big, some of them are scattered as much over as a city block. They're so big. They have multiple temperature requirements. Whether or not they should have multiple refrigerant temperature levels is very critical from the viewpoint of energy. But to me, I see so much of a lack of experience in people putting them together, and therefore I meet up with the plant owners who are still begging, what can I do to help reduce my costs?
Well, one of the things you do for FRIC is you do go out and do training courses to train these industrial operators.
Yes, we have two schools. One is basically for the service person. Now, service people, there's always a distinction there. One class of serviceman is excellent from a mechanical viewpoint. He can tear a compressor down, make repairs, and so forth. But then he's not necessarily acquainted with the thermodynamic properties of the particular refrigerant that's being used in order to analyze performance in the system, not performance of individual items like expansion valves and pressure regulators, but in the system to see what's going on in the various areas and pick out the areas where inefficiencies are occurring.
How do you feel that we can encourage, your scholarship that you have for Region 3, to encourage refrigeration interest in young students? How else do you think we can encourage them to come into our industry? Any other ideas?
As I see it, schools, you might say the youngsters are exposed to, we'll say, automobiles and possible repair, exposed to some of the electronic equipment and possible getting into that area. But there is nothing that tells them, now look, this refrigeration an air conditioning field is an excellent place to go. It's a place that's looking for qualified people, so why not become qualified in that area? And because of what I see of the lack of such incentive being placed to the youngsters, I said, well, let's set up some kind of an award and go out and say, now here's this award, you go into this field, which is a good field, and you can get some benefit from it.
So that's the kind of advice you would give to a young person trying to enter this field. Okay. Anything else that you would like to say in wrapping this up? Any other comments that you'd like to address?
Yes, I would like to comment on our refrigeration handbook. It's an excellent book, and I don't want to belittle the good things, but I do want to point out the fact that there are areas in there which specifically are stated that these are system practices. Now, the fact that they are system practices is true, but are they the best system practices? Because there are other practices available which, in my opinion, are better. So my quarrel would be that, look, if we wish to just stay with practices, then be sure we put in all of the different practices and not just one in one particular manner.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for joining me this morning, taking time out of your schedule to meet with me and to perform this interview at this chapter's regional conference in Philadelphia. Thank you, Garland.
Okay, welcome.